Hello and welcome to Property Matters here on Dublin South FM. You can contact the show on social media at iPropertyRadio or indeed email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. Your host for today is myself, Carol Tallon, and I'm delighted to be joined by Rosie Webb, Senior Architect at Limerick City and County Council and Head of Urban Innovation. Now, Rosie, I'm so delighted to be joining you today because we've known each other now for a little while. I'm so excited about the work you're doing in Limerick. So I'm delighted we have an opportunity to explore it today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Carol, and thanks very much for having me.
Rosie, Senior Architects in Limerick City and County Council. So obviously that's a role that people will be familiar with. Head of Urban Regeneration. What does that look like? What is your job?
Well, as a senior architect, unusually, I work in the economic development department. And I came in really with the brief of looking at the revitalisation of particularly the city centre and the historic towns. So my job, the section that I set up, which is actually called Urban Innovation, is a new section that was set up because we were successful in getting a couple of large funding streams that were targeted on the Georgian neighbourhood. So the department is a kind of multidisciplinary team. So we have myself, I have another architect there, I have a number of planners, I have an energy engineer, and then we have people who are working as kind of collaboration managers. So it's a new kind of a department, a new kind of service the local authorities is engaged in.
Well, obviously there's some great work being done because I was actually speaking to a property consultant based in Dublin a couple of weeks ago for the show, and he talked about how Limerick could become the centre of sustainability on the smart city side of things in Ireland. And I thought that was so exciting. So there's quite a bit of buzz about one programme that you're operating in particular, the Smart City Exchange. So you might just give us a little bit of background about that.
Yep. So the City Exchange project is a European funded project, and it's called the Horizon 2020 project. And Limerick is really the first city to be a lighthouse city under that program. And the program is really about creating a positive energy block in the city. And then hopefully rolling that out to the district level and to the city and the whole world. And really what happens is you have kind of two cities who start, a number of cities that follow, and then the idea is more about replication, how we do it in other places.
Well, and that's so important because when we talk about innovation, not everywhere is going to get the funding. The funding that is so vital to be able to try things and allow things to potentially fail so that you can learn from them and try more things. What's really interesting here is that you're doing it not on new properties, and that's where we've seen a lot of the energy initiatives happening in cities and around city blocks at the moment. It's been on new buildings, so you're actually going into very old buildings. How is that working?
Yeah, it's very challenging, Carol. I won't lie. It is very challenging, partially because, obviously there's the inherent aspects of trying to get the old fabric of the buildings up to the new energy ratings, but also because you're working with a lot of different properties, a lot of different property owners. And one of the issues with historic buildings is that the property ownership becomes fragmented. And so really what we're trying to do is to get people to work together, to enable groups of people working together. So that's very difficult. I often say to people, it's a bit like, it's not like asking you to lose 10 pounds. It's like you saying, Carol, you have to make me lose 10 pounds. So what you're trying to do is activate and enable people to work that way. But what I would say about the historic structure is that it is inherently energy efficient. Just the kind of high density, sort of 6-story high terraced block is actually quite a sustainable form. And the Georgian neighborhood in particular was built in this kind of logical grid system that always took into account the energy needs. So there were a lot of people don't know this, but under the streets of Georgian Limerick and Georgian Dublin, there are vaults that would have been where coal would have been delivered, and obviously fireplaces and people would have filled those in. Or that's how the building would have worked technologically. And now we're trying to kind of repurpose that logic into the kind of new energy systems. So interestingly, in its form, it's very energy efficient. And I think once we can kind of crack the way of getting people to work together, it would be very easy to kind of bring that all up to speed very quickly.
See, I would imagine that given the given the focus on not just climate action at the moment, but also actually in revitalising our city centres, this would seem on paper like an easy sell, but obviously all of these come at a cost. So in terms of getting all of the individual property owners to work together, how difficult was that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a continuing difficulty, but one of the ways that we're tackling this is because we've set up a kind of one-stop shop. We've been fortunate enough to have a tax incentive that's active in that neighborhood. So the Living City initiative is active there, and so we've been able to kind of make it easier for people to do all of the statutory work. So we have a one-stop shop in which we get everybody together at one place at the same time. So we have our conservation officer, our planner, our fire officer, ourselves talking about the tax incentive. We can then, kind of tell people all at once what they have to do. They also have a face, a name, a person that they can contact. And then we begin to build up relationships with people, and we can kind of do some matchmaking when we see there are things, say, within a block that makes sense. So we're kind of at that now. Last week we had this City Engage Week. We've just taken on 24 energy champions. So different people, from property owners to just people who are interested, who might not even live in the area, focusing on things from as various as renovating the properties to learning how to become a prosumer, to learning maybe taking on some, let's say, uh, uh, e-mobility solutions themselves. And I think trying to kind of broadcast that out and let people get in touch with each other really is how that works.
And the block that you're dealing with at the moment, what is that made up of? Is it a mix of residential, commercial?
Yeah, so the positive energy block is 5 buildings.
Mhm.
So it's our kind of anchor tenant is Gardens International, and that's a LEED Gold Standard building that was recently done up by Limerick 2030, our development company. And then there are 4 other participating buildings in that: the post office, Rooney's Auctioneers, the Chamber of Commerce, and the youth services, the Limerick Youth Services. So together, all of those buildings have to generate more energy than they're consuming, and they're assisted by doing that by being part of a community grid.
District heating is something that's been explored a lot in Ireland. We're seeing a project being talked about using waste heat coming from data centres, say in Tala. Have we an example of it working in Ireland yet?
I'm not too sure, Carol. On our project, we're using it's really more of a virtually created exchange of energy. We are intending to put in a river turbine that will form part of the energy. Of course, part of the energy will be from actually just saving energy in each of the buildings, so retrofitting, but also trying to install as much PV panels as we can. And then the energy storage works through a community grid, which is a virtual system. So we have a digital twin of the area, and we have an energy company called Smart and Power working on how that let's say that energy gets exchanged and how people might get the benefit of that energy. We don't have a particular district heating system in it, but we definitely think it is something that it will be one of the solutions going forward for climate change. Like, we've recently designated that area and a slightly larger area that includes the Colbert Station quarter as a decarbonization zone. And we think one of the key projects that we need to look at there is how we could enable something like a district heating system.
Okay. Your role is a particularly interesting one because we are starting to see the emergence of smart city departments with different focus, and positive energy would be one side of that. But you're actually involved in urban regeneration as well. And I know that's a word that has really fallen out of favor amongst communities. And I think that I don't think that's an Irish condition. I think it's a global condition. So you refer to it as urban revitalisation. But we have this prevailing problem in city centres and indeed in town centres of dereliction. Has this been an issue for Limerick?
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons we decided to target this area, is because we knew in the Georgia neighborhood we had a lot of dereliction and vacancy. So we did a kind of survey before we started. There was a city center health check, and in this area, which is I suppose we've defined the area because it had most of the historic buildings, and I think there's a link there, right? So there's about 23 city blocks, and that area is about something like 35 hectares. So there's about 2,400 people living in there. And within that area, we identified that there's something like 900 buildings there, but we had 92 fully vacant buildings in 2018. And so we knew this was a problem, and we knew that, there needs to be a proactive approach to it. So, we've, like I said, we've done this kind of carrot and stick approach where we're putting out derelict notices, but then we're also letting people know about the tax incentive, giving them some help. And we had an update to that survey, and we found that we've had a 27% reduction in vacancy in those fully vacant buildings. There could be additional vacancy that's being dealt with in buildings that were half vacant, or just the upper floors vacant. So we think that's a good indicator that we're having an impact.
27% is huge, but
Yeah.
what is the makeup of that? Who's coming into the area, or is it people consuming more space?
No, it's interesting. We have so those are all quite small developments, and that's also, I think, one of the issues, Carol, is it's micro development. You know what I mean? You're talking about sort of individual Georgian buildings. So each of those buildings, and we've had everything from, we have a number of people doing single family homes, people developing kind of executive residences, 1 and 2 bed apartments and studios. We have a kind of it's been very interesting to see the kind of innovation and creativity in that kind of development area. We've managed to allow, kind of, I suppose, activate some of the buildings ourselves with our own social housing. So we have a Housing First scheme that Peter McVerry Trust are doing in 2 of the properties, which were previously owned by the OPW. So it's interesting. It was just really trying to get in touch with them. We also have a developer who's very actively working in putting together people who want the tax incentive with let's say, long-term rental options. So again, Peter McVerry Trust will be supporting a local developer to use the tax incentive to do up a couple of those buildings. And we think that we can also pivot that now into affordable. So this morning, the Affordable Housing Act is coming forward. So we think there'll be big opportunities to kind of to do that sort of creative combination for things like affordable housing or key worker housing. And then we're also really interested in looking at some new models ourselves. So we're actively looking at the area of community-led housing, which is very new to Ireland, isn't being done, but how can we empower communities themselves to become developers and managers of properties in the long term. So we're looking at that. It's very difficult, Carol, because there isn't really I think let's say the legislative and the regulatory environment isn't quite there yet. So we're looking at kind of stepped approaches to these things. But yes, there's it's very much micro development, and maybe what we think is that if we can get 2 property owners working together, that's a much better solution. And I suppose if you think about the way, I mean, the Georgian area was speculative when it was built, in the 1780s. And people would have built sort of 2 or 3 properties together and then broken them up and sold them as family homes. And it's almost as if you need to do that reassembling of property, with these various property owners to get them working together.
I think it's very positive that you're looking at this beyond the scope of what local authorities can do, and really looking at the role that individual property owners have to play, and indeed developers. In terms of new models, I think, the more I explore, I have a lot of partnerships working with organizations outside of Ireland, across a number of different continents. And one of the things I've seen is that, we are quite focused, a narrow focus, in what we think works. And, that's largely attributable to how things get funded as well. So when you talk about community-led housing, what do you mean? Sorry, just to explain, because I don't understand the concept of community-led housing, or what that might look like in Ireland. Do we have a picture of it working successfully somewhere else, so we can say, okay, this is a model that might work for Ireland?
Yeah, it's been very much working recently in London, and I think it was something that the Greater London Authority set up really to address the issue of affordable housing. And the way that they have done it is that they have set up these community hubs, and so they do have these groups that give professional assistance and make small seed funding to local groups to be able to develop these projects from the bottom up, if you like. And they also have done something which is very interesting, is they set up a small sites portal. So they are able to, find these small sites that are either derelict or vacant, or people might even donate into the small sites portal, that allows kind of small developers and small groups of let's say community-led housing groups to come together to make proposals for them. So it's very much it's a kind of a new thing, I think, in the UK, but probably most active in the last 5 years, because there was a Localism Act passed there, and that kind of, I suppose, made it a little bit more compulsory, I suppose, to begin to address these sort of things. We haven't had that sort of a top-down, let's say, I suppose, instigation of it here, but there's certainly an interest in it, and I think there's a number of let's say research projects that are being funded through the housing agency, and our own project through the Department of Housing and Planning, and local government, that have enabled us to kind of figure out how to do that here. And I think that's where we'd like to be a part of that effort.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to put it in the context of tapping into smaller sites or underused space. It's something that we've seen certainly across London. 20 years ago and longer, London was absolutely taking a head start in this. They were taking the lead. I remember one of the underground Victorian bathrooms in Crystal Palace nearly 20 years ago converted into a one-bed apartment. And we actually worked with a local authority here to see if a similar approach could be taken. And we actually ran a competition that was where we got the community to actually report underused or unused sites in the city centre. And it was so interesting what we got, because we wanted people to be creative. So we were getting things like derelict handball alleys, and there was a lot of CIE ground, like under bridges and things like this. But it was really interesting to tap in. And, this was coming from looking at London and how not just, these Victorian underground bathrooms, but also things like, at the time they were putting sleeper carriages, old train carriages on city rooftops to create live work units and things like that. And this is genuinely going back more than a decade and a half ago. And there was such a sense of excitement about how a city could be opened up, how underused space could be reimagined. And there was a number of different initiatives, particularly around Dublin. I'm not so sure about Limerick. And everything ran into policy problems. There was issues with everything. We couldn't get engineers to sign off on buildings that would allow, flat top buildings that would allow any sort of structure on top. And just, there seems to be a lot of systemic challenges to innovation. And, so obviously as head of urban innovation, how are you getting around, policy issues like that?
It's interesting that, Carol, you mentioned that, and we are actually working with one of our companies in the City Exchange project, is Space Engagers, who did a similar project here, where they ran they had an app where people could report dereliction and vacancy, and we're working with them now in a whole system. I suppose it's an innovation ecosystem that we're establishing through the City Exchange project. And really what we do is we try to work with, let's say, local groups, but also communities of interest and innovators and, makers and all kinds of people like that, to try to come up with solutions. So we're setting up a citizen innovation lab, and we have let's say the Georgian neighborhood is designated as an innovation playground. And really what that allows us to do is to test out sort of new solutions together with the regulators. And so, for instance, the first version of that will be, the exchange of energy. So, for instance, you can't sell energy back to the grid now under our regulations. We're working with the CRU and also ESB, who are our partners on this, and ESB Innovate, to figure out how you would do that. How do you protect consumers in a situation like that? And so we're sort of a test bed. And so we're sort of setting ourselves up as the city itself becoming a living lab where people can test out solutions. And so we run an open call that people can come forward with solutions. In our first open call that we had, which was focused on laneways, we worked with a startup company called StreetSeek, who wanted to put in kind of citizen sensors to begin to measure things like footfall, air quality, that sort of thing. And interestingly, when we put that in, that was just about the time that COVID struck. So they had these sensors in, and what was interesting is that they could through that measure how well people were doing their social distancing, which is something they hadn't predicted when they started. We're also supporting a company called Safe Facility through an SBIR program to look at solutions for fire safety in these old buildings. And the solution coming forward is very much a smart tech solution, which is, the idea of, how buildings could certify themselves, and how we might use that system to be a sort of in-between person between the let's say the regulatory landscape and, let's say, the property owner themselves, so that you get this service in between that helps people to report on compliance. So we definitely think that that those kind of digital systems, so both the digital twin that we have, but also these let's say these mapping platforms, these processes that allow people to kind of propose solutions and then test them out together with these companies, is kind of essential to kind of bringing those kind of new, figuring out what the products we need. And then just that thing that you're talking about, Carol, how does it get through a regulatory system? Or more importantly, how does the regulatory system change to enable those things? So that, that I think it's a process-led thing, and it has to involve all these actors. It has to involve the local authority, these innovators themselves, but also the people who use it. So I think that's the real, let's say, differentiator, is that we're trying to involve the people themselves who will use it. We're also involving all the academic, so our partners are UL and this project, but we're also working with the other third level institutions and trying to set up new training solutions. So one of the things we've discovered is that there's a real mismatch between historic properties and people who do up buildings for energy. So if you find someone who knows how to do up a historic property, which is very particular way of doing it up, because they have a different kind of construction than new cavity wall construction, they don't seem to know a lot about energy upgrades. And likewise, if you call someone in to do the energy upgrades to your old building, they will know very little about, historic properties and how they need to be done up. So we're now kind of targeting, let's say, training programs around this for both professionals and tradesmen. We're not doing it ourselves. We're working with the people who do that already. The Heritage Council, the let's say the local institutes of technology. So we're really this kind of, let's say, in between. We're kind of enabler and kind of activator in that's our role in this, and it's important, I think, that the local authority does that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I mean, you mentioned there about your work with one particular prop tech startup, and on the fire and safety systems there, and how that was actually managed under the SBIR program. The SBIR program is such an important one, because one of the things that I've mentioned to you previously, and one thing I've been very vocal about, is that prop tech, not just prop tech, obviously that's my interest, but startups, when trying to work with local authorities to innovate. And by the way, I think that local authorities, much like established businesses, they need the innovation coming from startups who are exploring these interesting things. However, our public procurement process have been really weighted against these startups, because while they're innovating something new, they clearly don't have the experience to qualify under public procurement and tendering processes. So it's been a really interesting dynamic to see how startups can work successfully, particularly with any state agencies, and actually be in a position then to deliver paid services. So I think the SBIR is probably one of the models that seems to be working. So just before we finish up today, you might just explain, maybe if there's any innovators here who are at quite early stages of their business and therefore feel they mightn't be big enough to approach a local authority. I presume you're very open to early stage startups who have interesting ideas, maybe that have yet to be proven. Maybe the testing environment or the playground essentially would be a good setup for them. Is there a process by which they can contact you and get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's, I was talking about this innovation ecosystem that we've set up. We run these city engage weeks. At the moment, they are focused purely on the positive energy block, because they're sponsored through the city exchange program. But we hope to sustain that, and really designating it as part of the decarbonization zone, looking at the wider kind of climate change issues. And the way that works is we run these City Engage weeks. They have a number of activities that happen. We run those twice a year. And the idea of those City Engage weeks is to determine to get some ideas for what might be the topic of the next open call. So that's followed up by an open call. At the moment, we have small pots of money. We have 20 grand to run 3 of those. So the first one, we had 5 companies that we supported. They each got 5 grand. And they weren't just companies, they were also community groups. And we asked them to team up as groups. And then the last one that we've had was focused on renewable energy. So again, we're actually supporting 6 groups in that. So we'll be doing another one. So we have a program of these open calls that we will be ramping up and continuing to do over the next number of years. So absolutely, I mean, certainly anyone can contact us at Urban Innovation at limerick.ie. You can go on to limerick.ie, our website, and if you look in the Georgian neighborhood, you can contact us through there. And that also sets up the program for these City Engage weeks. So that's, I think, the way to kind of feed into the ideas of how the next open call. So you were talking about procurement, Carol, and I think, competitions are procurement. Do you know what I mean? And so these are small scale competitions that help to begin that process where anyone can come in, and they actually get supported both financially and through our assistance to try to kind of target that innovation where it's best placed, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's it's a good system. I'm so happy to see actually the playing field being somewhat leveled so that startups can actually get involved. So thank you so much for all the amazing work that you're doing. How can people follow along with the project? Particularly, I think the Positive Energy District, I think that's one that towns all around Ireland will be watching just to be able to learn from it. So are the updates being shared publicly, or how can people follow along?
Yeah, so if they go to limerick.ie, and if you put in City Exchange, you'll find our page that you can follow. So you can join onto that and follow the City Exchange progress.
Super. Thanks a million. That was Rosie Webb, Senior Architect at Limerick City and County Council and Head of Urban Innovation. We need to take a quick break. Stay tuned.